right, I think we can get started. Thank you so much for joining. I love that I see so many people here. Today we're going to talk about 3 reasons why agile design fails and how to prevent them. So before we get started, who am I? My name is Sarah Loigge. You can call me Sarah or Sarah, and I'm the design lead at Parkside Interactive. We're a web agency, so we design apps and websites for various clients in agency settings. So we have mid to long-term projects with various clients. And over the last 2 years, we've been really trying to integrate the agile process in our design processes. And that comes with various challenges that I'm going to talk about today. Now, even if you are from a product company, I hope that some of the problems and solutions will resonate with you and will help you out along your journey when you're trying to see how you can fit design into an agile framework. All right, so you've probably seen this chart or a similar one like 100 times in the last day. I just want to illustrate something here in the design context. So waterfall project management or the waterfall framework relies on one final outcome and a linear process. I think this is something that a lot of you are probably already aware of. And agile, on the other hand, follows a sprint, an iterative process where you have different outcomes in smaller iterations, and you might not really know what your final outcome actually looks like, but it gets closer to what the users actually need and to what your business needs are. And let's, in comparison, look at user-centered design. User-centered design is one of the design frameworks that's been around for a long, long time. There's also lean design, which is similar, just uses different terminology. And what we can see here is that we also have somehow an iterative process here, right? We first need to understand what the users need. We need requirements, which is already the same terminology as we might know from our agile world. Then we design something, and then we test and validate what we designed. And if it doesn't work, we do the same thing over and over again. Sometimes we have to redesign, sometimes we have to redefine our requirements. So if we compare agile and the user-centered design, we see that it is actually quite similar. And that is because the user-centered design approach is agile by nature. Now, those are the good news for today, that the way we work in design is already agile by the nature that, the work that we do. So 2 years ago, when I got more involved in our design processes in our team, we thought, okay, our developers already work with Scrum, so why don't we as designers integrate ourselves? So I thought about, okay, our designers and developers, they already work together in cross-functional project teams. There's no bad blood. When our developers and designers work together, everything works like a charm. So there shouldn't be any issues, right? My expectations were that by integrating ourselves in this agile, maybe Scrum process, we would have a streamlined end-to-end process. We would have the same structure for the meetings. We would have a very streamlined communication. We thought the clients would know what to expect because they know what to expect from our development teams. And we also thought that the handoff between design and development would be easier and faster. Yeah, so much for my expectations. The reality looked a bit like this at first. So when we started, we took the same process that we knew from our development projects and we just applied it to our design processes, and that did not work out. So that's how some of the problems arose. I'm going to talk about the specific problems we had and kind of try to align them with all the things that might relate to you or your work. Oh, sorry. Oh, goodness me. Okay. We need some elevator music. Da, 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 da. Yes, I think. I'm sorry for all the online people who didn't see anything I was talking about. My apologies. Technology is hard sometimes. Should I look for something for you? Which one is it? What do you need? Disable, okay. I think this one, yeah. All right, perfect. We can continue. Thank you for your help. So let's try to go back. Or maybe not. Oh no, let's do it like this. Let's go back. Yes, so this was the mess we found ourselves in because we applied the development agile process to design without considering all the differences between the design process and the development process. Because I had the assumption, okay, because our processes are iterative, they're also agile and it works, and that was not true. So I'm mostly going to refer to Scrum. I know that Scrum is not synonymous with Agile. Scrum is an Agile framework, and it's a very common one. And I know that some of the problems I will talk about are a bit more specific for Scrum and not just for Agile. So please bear with me. If I do exchange the terms, I apologize in advance. I will try to make it as clear as possible. But for the sake of keeping it simple and short, I will focus on Scrum because that's the framework that we've been working with. And for those of you who don't know too much about Scrum, it's this Agile framework where you have daily Scrum. So you have daily stand-up meetings, you have a product backlog, you have a board with to-do, in progress, and done. You have reviews with a client and retrospectives on a regular sprint basis. Usually the sprints are 2 weeks long. And yeah, that's a very short summary of what Scrum is. Please work, yes. Here are some of our sticky notes from when we started. Oh, I think they're hard to read, but I'm going to read out some of them. So when we started integrating this agile process, we did retrospectives and postmortems. And what we found were there were a lot of problems with designing agile. So you see slow pace on the sprint, didn't get the tickets done, Jira board sometimes a bit cluttered. There are mentions of our design processes and questions about it. And the most interesting one is on the bottom right, where it says some wireframe inconsistencies are popping up, which means our design work quality went down because of the process we implemented. And I will get back to that in just a bit. Yes, it works again. Let's start with reason number one, high uncertainty. I mean, this one doesn't surprise anyone, I think. At the beginning of a project, you have very, very high uncertainty. And for designers, even more so. Sometimes when development starts with their agile project or a process, they have some sort of requirements and they probably already have some designs. Like usually what we build in design is the building plan for what developers estimate and build on in their agile process. But we as designers have to make that first. And what we often have is very rough outlines of requirements. Sometimes we don't have anything at all. Maybe we have a few user stories, or maybe we just have the idea from one stakeholder that says, I have this idea for this great feature, do it. And this high uncertainty leads to a lot of problems. First of all, design work is not as predictable in this case, because if I tell you, think about a dog, some of you might think about a poodle, some of you might think about a German Shepherd, some of you might think about the red dog from that kids show, God knows what he's called. And everyone has a different picture in their head of what the final product should look like. And this is the kind of uncertainty that is not very predictable. I will talk about a real life case in a project that we had later on. Therefore, estimates also become guesswork. I also like to call them guesstimates, because most of the time when you estimate design work or you try to figure out how many story points could a feature be or a task, it's really a very rough guess. And in the end, the hours and the time spent often doesn't really add up. Also, design change requests consume time and resources. I will talk about change requests in a little bit, because change requests are really difficult to define in a design context, and they cause a lot of issues. Also, therefore, sprint goals aren't met and development is blocked. And us designers know that the worst thing that can happen is that development is blocked. That is usually the worst case for the PO, and puts a lot of pressure on the designers to deliver something recurringly that is actually handed off and finished. So how do we deal with high uncertainty? We want to, of course, reduce the uncertainty, and there are a few ways that we do this. So first of all, our requirements should be the lowest fidelity prototype. So in design, we have low fidelity and high fidelity prototyping, wireframing, and designing. And our requirements have to serve as this lowest fidelity prototype. What does that mean? The requirements have to be ready, and they should be as complete as humanly possible before the next sprint or before the start of the project, because if they are not, you have even more uncertainty. Also, this is really important. It kind of counterfeits what I just said. Requirements define the what, not the how. If requirements go into detail and say, we need a button that does this and that, this is already the solution to the requirement, right? Maybe it's not a button you're going to need, maybe it's a link, etc. And you're going to run into issues because maybe your client or a stakeholder will say, well, we said in the requirement there should be a button here, but there's no button. And then we have to explain, wait a minute, yeah, because we designed it differently and there's no button needed anymore. So requirements define the what, not the how. Don't waste your time on trying to outline what the design should look like in the requirements. Force initial user research and workshops. This is our biggest measure we have against this uncertainty that we have in beginning of a project. So what we want is we want to do these workshops so that we get insights into users, into the stakeholder and business needs, and those serve as the decision base. You need to remove this idea of, or this problem where a stakeholder may say, I like this and I don't like that. These are not informed decisions, they're personal, subjective opinions. So we need to have some sort of decision base and say, due to our user research, we found out that we need to set up the form like this, or that we need to prioritize this feature over another feature. And it gets everyone on the same page, ideally. And one of the methods I'm going to show you actually is perfect for that, because you get everyone into the same room. So how do we reduce the uncertainty? This is just a graph from before. We need to do research and workshops in the start. And some of the methods that we use is, so I mentioned user research. This is user interviews, if you can do it. At least some form of stakeholder interviews, or you need the business requirements, the business needs, but user interviews are usually the way to go. You can do workshops with your stakeholders to make them feel heard and get these initial requirements that they may not be able to formulate themselves. And you're going to need explorative tickets or tasks. These are tickets for designed features where the feature is still pretty unclear. You don't have a clear vision of what it's going to look like. You need explorative tickets that give your designers some space to play around and work it out and get a bit messy. And these tickets are impossible to estimate. You cannot estimate this. And this goes against Scrum, where you have maybe story points or complexity for each one. For explorative tickets, it's again a guesstimate and not an estimate. Reason number 2, Scrum rules versus the design reality. Scrum has quite strict rules, I feel, in terms of the Agile frameworks we have. And a lot of these rules or guidelines don't make any sense. Even if this works well for your development teams, I guarantee you will run into issues doing this with your design teams. So I just put one example here, the 2-week sprint. Why does the 2-week sprint not work in design? Imagine if you have 2 designers on your project, imagine how much they can design in 2 weeks. A shit ton of work. Okay, but you need to iterate, you need to get feedback way faster, because it could be that your designers designed something completely wrong for 2 weeks. And then you have to throw it all away. That's not what you want. So for example, 2-week sprints with just one review with the client at the end didn't work for us. Also, the ticket size or the task size affects the design work itself, and not just our burn down chart or how many tickets get finished. So you remember the sticky note from before where it says with inconsistencies in the wireframes, this is exactly this issue. And just to define, with ticket size, I don't mean the user stories or the estimation for the task. I mean the actual amount of screens you design or the amount of features you work on. So the amount of work that is behind one ticket. Is it a registration and login ticket, like one ticket for everything? Or is it registration, login, forgot password? You know, how granular are we with our tickets? This affects the actual design work, and I want to show you how. I'm still not sure where I have to point this thing for it to work. Right. So this may be a bit hard to read. I hope you don't really need to read anything here. It's just more about the structure. So this is how a Figma design file looks in one of our projects. And this was one of the first ones where we did agile design. And you see a really nice structure of the pages and separation of the designs and different features. And what you see here is we added headers for each Jira ticket, which is one design task. And what you see here is that there are overlaps. And these overlaps led to big confusion because as designers, we work on similar screens for a similar feature at the same time. And what we did before is we just copied the development tickets and said, now this is the version for the design, but it doesn't work. So for example, there's an overarching bigger ticket here that encompasses the whole flow. This was like a setup ticket for development. And then there's another ticket that describes a big chunk of the bigger one. So now in our stand-ups, we would hear things like, yeah, I have 4 tickets in progress, but I'm actually just working on this one feature. And now I put this one in review because this part needs to be reviewed, but the other not. Or I had to put this big ticket in progress, but I'm not working on a big part of it. I'm just working on this part. And it led to a lot of confusion, and it started to create inconsistencies in the design and the status of what is actually going on. So how can we combat this? First of all, we needed different ticket or task structures for designers than for dev. And my advice for you would be to take your designers and say, hey, we have these features. How do you want your tickets to look like? And they will tell you, because in their head, they already have the visual separation of, okay, registration is this part with like a little form, and then we have a dashboard and we have the widgets, etc. And they will be able to tell you how granular the tickets should be, so that if they work on Figma, they don't have so many overlapping tasks, and they can just say, okay, I'm working on this ticket, and it is these kind of designs. Now, this is a tough one for all the POs or maybe Scrum Masters. The overall design budget used is more telling about the progress of design than the finished ticket count or the ticket estimates. I mentioned the estimates before. They're guesstimates. They're often not realistic, even if we have a lot of experience in design and we know how much something is going to take. So how can you keep your design in check and see that the progress is there and you're not burning unnecessary hours, etc.? You need to have the overall roadmap and milestones in mind and keep a certain percentage of, okay, how much of our roughly overall estimated design budget did we use, or how many percent of that, right? Maybe you used 5% of design budget for this first feature and you have another 20 coming. So it's approximately okay, it works fine. But this can make people freak out because they see, okay, for these tickets we had 3 story points, but then it was like 20 hours of work. How could that be, right? And then you suddenly have to argue and figure out what's going on. So my advice for you would be to trust the process and loosen the constraints a bit. Because in design, we need to do more work in the beginning than is usually estimated for separate tasks. We need to set up the design system. And if there's no separate ticket for that, it falls into those first few tickets, whatever that is. So maybe registration suddenly takes longer because the designer has to set up the design system, create the input fields that will later on also be used somewhere else. So we have a lot of work to do in the beginning, and that work helps us to have less work in the end. So in the beginning, it looks scary and you're thinking, oh my God, design is using all of this budget, but in reality, it's work that is simply done upfront and helps us later down the line. Kanban, I mentioned here, if you do see that something like Scrum doesn't work for your designers, try it with Kanban first. Often it's also a learning process for the designers. They often haven't worked in an agile framework before, and Scrum can be quite overwhelming. So I would say start out with Kanban and see how far you get with that, and then you can try Scrum. So let's get to our reason number 3. And this one sounds more complicated than it is, really. Interdisciplinary dependencies. That's really where my language skills came out. So you remember this chart that we saw before with the uncertain, very certain. In the beginning, we do some research. And in reality, we've long ago abandoned this process where we just have a client or a stakeholder say, this is what I want, and development codes it right away. There are many, many steps in between nowadays to ensure a good quality of the design, of the user experience, and of the actual software that will be created in the end. And that can be a lot of steps, and they are dependent on each other. You cannot skip. I mean, you could technically skip one or two of the steps, but you have to accept that maybe the quality of your design and of your development work will go down. So the steps that we have is UX design, where we create the user experience, we create wireframes, sketches of what will later on be developed. Then with UX writing, this is my specialty. This is more of an optional step where we take a specific look at the text to further improve the user experience. And then with UI design, this is where the visual part happens. The colors come in, the fonts, the final layout, the final building block for what the developers will do in the end. And within these steps, we cannot skip one or the other. We need to do UX first and then UI. We also have iterations. We show wireframes to the client. The client says, this is not what I want. I want it to be different. We have to do another iteration. We have to do another one. And then in UX writing, they say, maybe the text, we need to change the text. Or maybe in UI design, they come and say, actually, this text, I don't like it after all. We need to change it. So there are a lot of iterations happening within each steps, and that increases the amount of time we need to get from one step to another. So Sprint Zero is a myth. I think Sprint Zero is one of the biggest issues we had in the beginning, because the Sprint Zero for setting up a project and getting the initial requirements, etc., leads to a belief that the design can be done upfront. And then the development starts. This is not Agile. This would be first we do design and waterfall, and then we do Agile development. This is not Agile design. And secondly, it also implies that this kind of design work can be done within one sprint or maybe 2 Sprint Zeros. And that usually doesn't work. You need more time to work on the design, and it will eventually happen continuously together with development. And you need to have a bigger head start from development, because otherwise development will get blocked as soon as you're stuck on certain iterations of features, but the developers need new stuff to work on. So this kind of idea of having Sprint Zero and just using this for your design work doesn't work unless you have a very small feature and a very well-known software product with big constraints. Then it might actually work. But if you're trying to create a new software from scratch that doesn't have any predefined work, this doesn't work. Change requests are a gray area. I mentioned this before. Let's talk a bit about it more in detail. What are change requests really? Is a bug fix a change request? I'm asking you. No. A bug fix is not a change request. What about design changes? Let's say the client says, I want a registration. You design a registration. You show it to the client, says, this is not what we want. Now they come back with feedback and say, we need another input field for 2-factor authentication, or we need this and that, because we define the user story somewhere that says that we need some sort of verification of the person so that they have a real identity. But it was never defined how that was going to look. Is that a change request? Not really. It's just that the people didn't know, that the stakeholders, the client didn't know at the time what they need and what it should look like. So they throw it back to you, and you have to work on it now. You need to create this now, because it's going to influence the rest of your design. You cannot take it as a change request, put it in the backlog and deal with it later. It's not possible, because design is dependent on each other. Let's say you figure out that a pattern in your design didn't work. For example, you had a form, or everywhere where you have a form and you need to fill something out, you have a disabled button, and it only turns enabled once you filled out all mandatory fields. Maybe in your user testing, you find out that 5 out of 7 users are confused by that. You need to change it everywhere. You need to touch designs that were handed off that might already be in development. And this is where maybe this turns into a change request for development. But it's not really a change request for all these other areas that were signed off. So this whole change request process doesn't really work for design, because design is a living document with all these different parts that need to be updated continuously as we learn more and more about the final requirements. And the issue that comes with that is that if development is really close behind, those change requests have a waterfall-like effect, and these design changes are dismissed and it's put into the backlog and said, okay, let's do it later on. But what you have to tell your PO in that moment is, if we do this later, we need to update not only 5 designs, we need to update 50. Because in all of those designs, we're using this element or we're using this pattern. And it leads to way, way more work down the line. In the worst case, even with stuff that is already developed. So change requests are really a tough nut. Let's just say it's a tough nut to deal with. Oh, there we go. So how can we solve this? This is the biggest issue I see and the most problematic one, and one that we are still working on. So the process that we've established at Parkset is not flawless. It doesn't work on every project, but it is something that we've been gradually working on in the last years. And what we really have to take care of in order to avoid this issue with the change request and the reality of our design work is to set up the project really well from the start and define a handoff process that is flawless. Sorry about that. So what you need to do is you need to plan enough sprints up front for no matter how uncertain your design is, right? So you need to figure out, okay, at what point can development actually start? At what point are we in a state with the design where things are not so uncertain anymore and the requirements are solid and the designs we've built are also solid for, I don't know, 30% of what we need to do overall. So you need to adjust your meeting setup. I love how in Agile you can turn, a framework like Scrum into whatever you need. And I'm just going to show you what worked for us. I mentioned before our 2-week sprint. This is something that we completely abandoned. We said we would do a stand-up every second day, not every day. If a project is critical, you can do it every day, but our designers didn't need it, so we put it to every second day. Review meeting once a week. This implies that we created 1-week sprints where we would, at the end of each week, sit together with a client. Why is that? Because I told you a lot of work can be done in 2 weeks. And let's say you only have 1 hour of a meeting with a client or a stakeholder. You cannot show everything. You cannot show everything. They say, I want a registration. You show them 20 screens of registration flow with the different states and everything. They're completely overwhelmed. They cannot sign it off immediately. They cannot give proper feedback. You need to do more review meetings with a smaller amount of work so that the client or the stakeholder can say, yes, this is it, continue. And we also said we need 1 additional internal review meeting to check the feasibility with developers, to check with the other designers in the team if, there may be mistakes, like, 2 pairs of eye principle, just to make sure that before we show something to the client or stakeholder, it is actually solid. And having the developers in those design review meetings is a charm. It's really, really helpful because they often uncover issues that in development would be way bigger and way more problematic if we don't fix it. So what I mentioned before about the flawless handoff process, the handoff process is a bit difficult. You saw before how many steps we have with client, UX writing, UI, and then development. How do you figure out a flawless handoff process? And this is where we basically created a Figma plugin. One of my colleagues created a Figma plugin, which is mentioned here, which is the Jira ticket sync. So we wanted our design file to speak for itself, okay? We wanted to make sure we don't have to have too many meetings to give our work to the designers in the next step, in the next process, or to the developers. So we had to figure out a really nice setup for our Figma file. Now, by now, it looks a bit different. So it's not those green headers anymore. They look way nicer. Lucas did a great job on this plugin. And what this does is it syncs your Jira tickets to Figma. If you have, let's say, you have a Jira ticket with, as a user, I want to be able to register. That's one user story. Okay, registration needs to be designed, right? You can basically import it into Figma. You will have this kind of header that tells you this is the ticket, this is the ticket number, this is the description, maybe the requirements are even in there. And suddenly you have everything in your Figma file and it is linked. So if your developers click on the link in the ticket, they get to the Figma file with those designs. They see the status of it, not just in the Jira board, but also in Figma, because the lanes in Jira are reflected in the Figma plugin. So you see, is it in review? Is it finished? It's amazing, and it was really a big game changer for how we hand off our work. In the middle here, you see that there's a new feature of Figma as well, which is called developer mode, where you can even mark designs ready for development. So they took a part of what we have in the plugin and turned it into an actual Figma feature, which really shows that there's a really big need for that. And what you see on the right is that we did also have to develop this process where we had to figure out, where do we communicate with each other? Do we communicate in the tickets? Do we communicate in Slack? We, for example, opted for the tickets because then the discussion is always related to the context of what the ticket is about. And this is something that you can take with you. I think if a project is very uncertain, it's best to over-communicate. And if it's a project that is very certain, then you can reduce the communication, because if everything is going smoothly, you don't need to, over communicate and talk too much, or have too many additional conversations. Let's just say it like that. So how is it looking nowadays? Here are some of our sticky notes from one of the projects. As you can see, people are talking about the process optimization, the open communication, the criticism. Everyone is really happy. We're not 100% there yet, but this was an improvement from the sticky notes you saw before of just 2 free sprints. Because during the actual project, we changed everything. We didn't stick with the process for this project. We changed it to improve it. And we were really happy when we saw that the process is working and the design quality and the handoff is going up in terms of quality. So yeah, if I want to leave you with one thought, it's this really nice quote I found. It's a bit emotional. I'm sorry about that. Our role is to imagine products that don't exist and guide them to life. Let's never forget that sometimes we create software out of purely an idea, an intuition, and there's nothing there yet. So we need to get messy. We need to have iterations. We need to still be able to explore and do workshops. And these kind of topics often don't fit into a very strict agile framework like maybe Scrum can be if you follow it to a T. If you have a research ticket, you can say, okay, it's going to take approximately 1 sprint, but you need to recruit the people. You need to see when they have time. You need to see how long it takes you to evaluate the results. It's really, those guesstimates, they often don't get us anywhere. So what I want to give you is just the feeling of, okay, even if we don't follow the agile process, how we know it from development, it can still be a good process for us in design. We just need to be a bit patient and be brave to make a lot of changes down the lane to see how we can accommodate the uncertainty that we design with. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for your attention. All right, I think we have time for some questions, if I didn't overwhelm you with everything I just said in half an hour. Yes.
In some part of your whole agile design process finding, did you try out with the workshop with the customer to first design a click dummy or stuff like that? Or would you say then when it comes to technical problems, then you have to re-implement the whole click dummy? Did you try something like that? Have you some experience?
For sure. So in our UX phase, we create these very rough designs, and we often also link them together in a click dummy, because when you create a click dummy, the people, like the clients and the stakeholders, can click through it and they get a way better feel for what's going on. It's a very, very good method to use. We just wanted to make sure that this is also part of our agile process, that it's not just something we do up front. You can do it as a proof of concept. If you're not sure if you're actually going to design a feature, if you're actually going to develop it, then you can do it up front. Otherwise, I would say put it right in that agile process and say, okay, the first thing we do is a UX click dummy of this feature. We show it, and then we see how it goes. Mm-hmm.
For user research and requirements engineering, how do your UX designers and product owners cooperate with each other?
Very good point. So the requirements are often linked very closely with the user research, because it could be that your stakeholders or your client comes to you and they have a very good idea in their head and they already have this picture very defined, but you don't even know if it makes sense for the product. So you may develop something that the users don't even need. So we try to get that user research in early. And the way we do this usually, first with the stakeholder, that's the first challenge. We uncover the uncertainties. So we start asking questions about the idea, about the requirements. And usually you get an answer that's something like, oh, we didn't even think about that yet. So that's when you know, okay, user research does make sense. So what we do is maybe we do a workshop or we do those interviews already in the Agile process. And first we say, okay, the user research, what part does it relate to? What requirements, what user story does it relate to? Or maybe it relates to an epic. Maybe you have an epic that's like, I don't know, mega awesome dashboard, right? A really big feature. And you say, okay, the user research relates to this. This is the requirements and everything we already have from the business. Most likely it's very low fidelity requirements, maybe 2-3 sentences of what's going on. Then we plan the research, we document it right there with the requirements, and we put the outcome right there as well. And then the requirements engineer, the PO, whoever is going to write those requirements, we hand it over in a presentation or maybe even just in the document itself, if it speaks for itself. And then they know, okay, maybe there are parts of the requirements that don't fit, and then they can adjust it. But it always needs to happen also with the stakeholders or with the client, because they need to be aware if you're making changes about the core idea or the requirements that you have. But I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you, it does.
Any more questions? Yes.
I hope I got everything right. So your designers have one sprint week and your devs have 2. So how do you handle stuff like retrospective? Do you have like separate ones? Do you have to get once a week? Is it every other week? How do you handle like retros or backlog refinements?
That's a very good question. So what we usually start with is the design sprints in 1 week, right? And development may start at the same time if they have something to set up, but usually we have like a heads up of 1 month-ish where the developers set everything up. So sometimes when we have enough time upfront with our design sprints, we can do enough uncertainty work in the beginning that we can then switch to the 2-week rhythm of the developers. So that's one option, to say, okay, as soon as development starts, we switch to the 2-week rhythm. But then we often still need to keep the weekly review meetings with the client because you still have a lot of questions. So that's one way to go about it. Or you separated it completely, but that sometimes beats the, the purpose of trying to find one agile stream. So those 1-week sprints we keep until the very end if it's a design only project for us. Because sometimes with projects that are only design and we don't do the development, we hand everything off and then the developers of the client take over. But ideally, you will start with the 1-week sprints and then you will switch to a similar rhythm than the developers to have the same meetings, iterations. You can have separate retrospectives for your designers. Yes, we do that sometimes when it doesn't make sense. Maybe only design work was done, might not make sense for developers to be a part of the retro. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's one. Oh, you have to run. I will come over here. I'm sorry if I was stuck on this side. I should have come over here a little bit.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights. During your talk, you were pointing out how important it is to have a good handover between the design team and the development team, and how important it is to reduce uncertainty at the beginning. I understand that. Have you experimented? Have you tried getting the team together, enlisting a UX designer into the development team? So not having these handovers because they're in the same development team for the same product, or Did you experience any problems with that?
Very good question. So as we said before, we integrate one developer in our design sprints for those reviews, right? To have the developer insights. We do the same thing the other way around. As soon as development starts, we're in the beginning especially still fully involved in design, because most of the time we're still working on designs, and we have the same stand-ups with the developers. We have the same review meetings with the developers, and later on, when the design is kind of completed and there's less involvement needed, we still have one designer working on certain tasks, working on open questions, and being part of whatever developer review meetings there are. Yes, just to make sure, because sometimes what you develop sometimes doesn't look like what you designed, right? So the developer sits in the meeting, is like, well, maybe that spacing needs to be fixed, or this button. So yeah, also to answer UX questions. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's one question from the chat.
Yes.
I will read it out. It's a follow-up question on the click dummy question we had. The question is, you tried disruptive design first, for example, generation of product with lots of changes, or you go step by step?
I hate giving the answer, it depends, but I guess this is one of the cases where I can say it depends. I think if you can be disruptive so what does disruptive really mean? That you can explore a lot, and that you can just throw out the ideas in some sort of rough design concept and see how it goes, like a proof of concept style, then go for it. Because usually through making those mistakes, you learn the most of what you actually need to change to get to this final design and the requirements that you need. And for clients and stakeholders, they often prefer to see something than to read something. So if you create a few designs without having any input or not much input, it can help the client to figure out what they want, and it can actually accelerate the requirements process part. So I would say try that if you can, and if you have the time and it is planned, that you say, okay, we have 2-3 weeks where we're just exploring and we're just putting things out, but you still need the continuous feedback from the clients and the stakeholders, so that you're slowly working towards the right path. And going step by step and saying, okay, we have the requirements, now we design, now we refine the requirements, etc. This works maybe a bit better when the uncertainty is not that high, because then you already have some better base to work off. Usually you do the designs, you do the further requirements. So yeah, it would be good for you to try out both and see how it goes. Also depends a bit on your designers and how many people you have available. That would be my hopefully answer to the question.
He says thank you.
Great. Okay, are there any more questions, or is everyone ready for the coffee break? Yes, there's one more question.
Thank you so much for this interesting talk. You said that you have weekly meetings with your clients and stakeholders to review the design. And I was wondering if your clients really understand the necessity of giving feedback so regularly, or if you ever heard, oh, we only want to see that design that will be included in the next major release.
Yeah, very real scenario, happens all the time. Usually we need to prime our clients in the beginning a little bit and manage the expectations and say, we're going to need your support with this, and we're going to need a few hours every week of your involvement so that we can proceed. Because the whole timeline of a project can be shifted if no feedback comes in. We can just keep designing. If we don't get the feedback, we cannot sign things off. We cannot say, okay, this is final or not. So a lot of our clients are in favor of it once we explain the process to them and they start trying it out. There are some who struggle with it because they don't have the time to sign something off every week or to take a look at the designs every week. And what you then have to think about is, okay, maybe we can extend to a longer sprint or to longer review intervals, or you give more time for the client or the stakeholder to look at the work and say, okay, we're giving it to you now. Sorry, was that me? Sorry, okay. So you might need to give the clients a bit more time and say, oh my God, it's still coming. What is this? Yeah, so give them a bit more time and say, okay, we had the review on Friday, and maybe until next Wednesday, they have time to review and sign it off. And in the meantime, you try to work on something else that is not too related. What you want to avoid is your designers being blocked, because that's an issue. And then your developers also getting blocked. If it's not possible for the client and you need to make longer intervals, you need to make your client aware that your designers are going to be blocked. That there will be times where they don't have anything to do and they're probably going to work on something else. So if the client accepts that and says, yeah, the project takes longer, the designers are blocked sometimes, then I guess they're fine with it. But yeah, happens a lot that there are issues with that. So yeah, sometimes it's just about the format. Is it a meeting? Can you do it asynchronously? Do you have to send smaller chunks more often, or need to try things out and see what works? All right. Any more questions? Okay. Everyone is looking very sad all of a sudden. I think it's time for some coffee. Thank you so much. If you have any more questions, come to me afterwards. And thank you for having me.